The day my own children locked me away in Willowbrook Manor, they thought they were sealing my fate forever. What they didn't know was that I had just signed the biggest acquisition deal of my life, and their precious safety measure had just become my newest business venture. By the time I was done restructuring their visiting policies, they would learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who built an empire from nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cora Anderson, and at 73 years old, I've been called many things. Steel Magnolia, Ice Queen, the Dragon Lady of downtown Portland's financial district. But the one title that mattered most to me was simply Mom, until the day my children decided that title gave them the right to make decisions about my life that weren't theirs to make. I built Anderson Capital Management from a cramped studio apartment with nothing but a business degree, $2,300, and a stubborn refusal to accept the word no. 47 years later, I owned a portfolio worth north of $200 million, with investments spanning everything from tech startups to real estate developments. My children knew this, of course. They'd grown up watching me turn failing businesses into gold mines, watching me navigate hostile takeovers with the precision of a chess grandmaster. What they apparently failed to understand was that age doesn't automatically equal incompetence, and a minor fall in my own kitchen doesn't constitute grounds for guardianship proceedings. The morning they ambushed me started like any other Tuesday. I was sitting at my marble kitchen island in the penthouse I'd called home for 15 years, reviewing quarterly reports over my usual breakfast of steel-cut oats and fresh berries, when my eldest son Marcus walked in using the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. He wasn't alone. Behind him was my daughter Samantha, clutching a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield, and bringing up the rear was someone I didn't recognize, a thin man in an ill-fitting gray suit who introduced himself as Dr. Peterson from Willowbrook Manor's intake department. I set down my coffee cup slowly, the way I'd learned to do in boardroom negotiations when I needed to buy myself a few seconds to assess the situation. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know about his level of comfort with whatever they were about to spring on me. Samantha, on the other hand, had that practiced look of concern that she'd perfected during her brief stint as a pharmaceutical sales rep. All furrowed brows and sympathetic head tilts that fooled absolutely no one who knew her well. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as care. They talked about my incident 3 weeks prior, when I'd slipped on a wet kitchen floor and bruised my hip. They mentioned my isolation in the penthouse, conveniently ignoring the fact that I chose to live alone because I valued my privacy and independence. They brought up my confusion about recent events, which was actually me questioning why Marcus had been asking so many detailed questions about my investment accounts and business partnerships lately. Dr. Peterson spread pamphlets across my granite countertop like he was dealing cards, each one featuring impossibly cheerful elderly people engaging in activities that looked about as appealing as a root canal. Willowbrook Manor offers comprehensive care for individuals transitioning into their golden years, he said in the kind of voice people use when they're talking to small children or very stupid adults. We have 24-hour medical supervision, structured social activities, and specialized memory care services. I looked from him to Marcus to Samantha, and something cold settled in my chest. Memory care services? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Are you suggesting I have memory issues? Marcus finally spoke up, his words rushing together like he'd rehearsed them but was afraid he'd forget his lines. Mom, you've been acting differently lately. Last week you couldn't remember where you put your car keys, and you seemed confused when I mentioned Dad's birthday. The audacity was breathtaking. My car keys had been in my purse, exactly where they belonged, and I'd been confused about his father's birthday because my ex-husband had been dead for 12 years, and Marcus had never once acknowledged the date before. But I could see what they were building, brick by carefully placed brick. A case for incompetence. A foundation for taking control. Samantha leaned forward with that practiced sympathy face again. We've been so worried about you living up here all alone. What if you fall again? What if something happens and no one finds you for hours? We can't bear the thought of you being in danger. I studied my daughter's face, searching for any trace of the little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her, who used to beg me to read her the same bedtime story 5 times in a row. That child was gone, replaced by this woman who could lie to my face with the skill of a seasoned politician. And you think the solution is to put me in a nursing home? I asked, keeping my tone level despite the fury building in my chest. It's not a nursing home, Mom, Marcus said quickly. It's an assisted living community. You'd have your own apartment, your own space, but with support when you need it. Dr. Peterson jumped in with his sales pitch. We have residents who are very active and independent. Golf courses, art studios, a full library. Many of our clients find that they're actually happier and more social than they were before. I picked up one of the pamphlets and flipped through it slowly, buying time while my mind raced through possibilities and calculations. The facility looked expensive, which meant they'd done their research. They knew I could afford it. They also knew that once I was classified as needing care, it would be much easier for them to make a case for taking over my financial affairs. How long have you been planning this? I asked, setting the pamphlet down and looking directly at Marcus. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. It's not like that, Mom. We've just been discussing options in case... In case what? In case I became inconvenient? Samantha's mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a flash of irritation before she smoothed it back into place. That's not fair. We love you, and we want what's best for you. What's best for me, or what's most convenient for you? The room went quiet, except for the soft hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic 23 floors below. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat and began shuffling his pamphlets back into order, clearly sensing that this wasn't going as smoothly as he'd hoped. Finally, Marcus played his trump card. Mom, we've already spoken with a judge. Given your recent behavioral changes and your living situation, we can petition for emergency guardianship if necessary. We're hoping it won't come to that. There it was. The threat wrapped in concern. The ultimatum disguised as choice. I looked at my son, my firstborn, the child I'd rocked to sleep every night for the first 2 years of his life because he had colic and would only settle if I held him. And I saw a stranger. Someone who was willing to use the legal system as a weapon against his own mother. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. I see. And I assume you've already chosen which facility you'd prefer to warehouse me in? Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be, Samantha said. And I could hear the edge creeping into her voice now that their cards were on the table. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the city skyline, at the buildings that housed companies I'd invested in, at the construction cranes marking developments I'd funded. 47 years of building, creating, succeeding, and they thought they could just sweep it all aside because I'd slipped on a wet floor. Fine, I said, turning back to face them. Schedule the intake appointment. The relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. Marcus actually smiled, probably thinking he'd just solved a problem that had been keeping him up at night. Dr. Peterson began pulling out paperwork with the enthusiasm of a man who'd just secured a commission. But they'd made a critical error. They'd assumed that because I was agreeing to their plan, I was accepting defeat. What they didn't know was that in 47 years of business, I had learned that sometimes the smartest strategy is to let your opponents think they've won, while you're quietly positioning yourself for a comeback that will leave them reeling. As Dr. Peterson handed me forms to sign, and Marcus rattled on about visiting schedules, and how this was really for the best, I was already 3 moves ahead. I was thinking about Willowbrook Manor's corporate structure, their parent company, their financial vulnerabilities. I was thinking about real estate portfolios and healthcare investments, and the kinds of acquisitions that could be completed quietly, behind the scenes, with the right legal team and enough capital. They wanted to put me somewhere they could control me, somewhere they could limit my access to my business, my resources, my independence. What they didn't realize was that they'd just handed me the perfect opportunity to show them exactly what happens when you corner a woman who spent 5 decades turning obstacles into opportunities. I signed their papers with a steady hand, my signature as sharp and decisive as it had been on every contract, every deal, every acquisition that had built my empire. And as I handed the clipboard back to Dr. Peterson, I allowed myself a small smile. When do we start?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I asked. 3 days later, I was sitting in a beige room at Willowbrook Manor, surrounded by furniture that looked like it had been selected by someone who'd never actually had to live with it, watching my children go through the motions of helping me settle in. The apartment was nice enough, a living room, bedroom, small kitchenette, and bathroom, but everything about it screamed institutional. The walls were that particular shade of cream that's supposed to be soothing but just looks bland. The carpet was low pile and stain resistant, and the windows had safety locks that prevented them from opening more than a few inches. Samantha was arranging my photographs on the prefab bookshelf with the kind of theatrical care that suggested she thought someone might be watching and judging her Daughter of the Year performance. Marcus was setting up my television and muttering about cable channels and parental controls, which was rich coming from a man I'd had to bail out of 3 different business ventures. The dining room serves breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, and dinner at 5, Samantha said, reading from a laminated schedule. There's bingo on Tuesday nights, book club on Thursdays, and something called chair yoga on Saturdays. I made appropriate noises of acknowledgement while privately calculating how long it would take to die of boredom if I actually participated in their scheduled activities. Chair yoga. As if regular yoga wasn't humiliating enough when you were 73. A knock at my door interrupted my dark thoughts, and a woman in scrubs entered without waiting for permission. She was young, maybe 30, with aggressively cheerful energy and a name tag that read, Jennifer, Activities Coordinator. Mrs. Anderson, welcome to Willowbrook Manor. I'm Jennifer, and I'm here to help you get oriented and find activities that match your interests. She had a clipboard, because apparently everyone in this place carried clipboards, and she was already making notes about God knows what. I wondered if there was a section for resident seems hostile or family reports memory issues. Now, I see here that you have a background in business, Jennifer continued, consulting her notes. We have a wonderful investment club that meets every Wednesday. Of course, we don't do any actual investing. It's more educational and social, but I think you'd really enjoy the discussions. An investment club that doesn't actually invest. I had to admire the absurdity of it. It was like having a cooking club that only talked about food, or a book club that just looked at the covers. Marcus and Samantha exchanged glances, and I could practically hear their thoughts. Look how nice this is. Look how they're taking care of her. Look how much better this is than her being alone in that big, scary penthouse. That sounds lovely, I said, because they clearly needed me to play along for a little longer. Jennifer beamed like I'd just made her day. Wonderful, and I see you're scheduled for a wellness check with Dr. Morrison tomorrow morning. He's our head of geriatric care, and he'll just want to get a baseline on your health and make sure all your medications are properly managed. Medications. Another control mechanism. Another way to monitor and manage and make decisions about my body without my input. I nodded politely while making a mental note to research Dr. Morrison's qualifications and professional history. After Jennifer left and my children finished their performative unpacking, we stood in the middle of my new beige prison and engaged in the kind of awkward small talk that happens when everyone is pretending everything is fine. You'll love it here, Mom, Marcus said, jingling his car keys in a way that suggested he was already mentally out the door. The grounds are beautiful and there are so many activities. And you're safe, Samantha added. That's the most important thing. Safe. That word had become their justification for everything. Safe from falling in my own home. Safe from making my own decisions. Safe from living my own life. They hugged me goodbye with the kind of quick, obligatory embraces that people give when they're relieved to be leaving, and I watched through my safety-locked window as they walked to Marcus's BMW in the visitor parking lot. They were both on their phones before they'd even reached the car, probably already moving on to whatever crisis or commitment came next in their busy lives. I sat down in the standard-issue armchair and looked around my new accommodations. Everything was designed to be safe, easy to clean, and impossible to personalize in any meaningful way. The message was clear. You are no longer in charge of your environment. You are no longer in charge of your choices. You are no longer in charge of your life. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that putting me in Willowbrook Manor would limit my resources and my reach. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 3 days before my admission making some very important phone calls and transferring some very substantial funds into accounts they didn't even know existed. My first call had been to Patricia Chang, my lawyer for the past 15 years, and one of the sharpest legal minds I'd ever encountered. Patricia specialized in corporate acquisitions, and more importantly, she understood the value of discretion and speed when it came to sensitive transactions. "Cora, are you sure about this?" she'd asked after I'd outlined my plan. "This is a significant investment, and the timeline you're suggesting is aggressive." "Patricia, I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I'd told her. "I want to know everything about Willowbrook Manor's corporate structure, their parent company, their financial position, and their vulnerabilities. And I want to know it by the end of the week." My second call had been to David Kim, my financial advisor, and the man who'd helped me navigate some of the most complex investment strategies of my career. David was the kind of advisor who didn't ask unnecessary questions when a client wanted to move large amounts of money quickly and quietly. "How liquid do you need to be?" he'd asked. "Completely. I want access to everything if necessary." "Everything?" "Everything." By the time Marcus and Samantha drove away from Willowbrook Manor that afternoon, I already had a team of forensic accountants reviewing the facility's books, a team of lawyers researching their corporate governance structure, and a team of investigators looking into the backgrounds of their key executives and board members. They thought they'd caged me. What they'd actually done was given me a front row seat to study my target. That evening, I sat through my first dinner in the Willowbrook Manor dining room, surrounded by residents who seemed to fall into two categories: those who were genuinely happy to be there and grateful for the care, and those who looked like they were serving a prison sentence they hadn't chosen. The food was adequate but institutional. Everything over-seasoned to compensate for aging taste buds, everything soft enough to accommodate dental issues, everything designed for efficiency rather than pleasure. I chose a table by the window and observed the staff interactions, the resident dynamics, the subtle hierarchies that develop in any institutional setting. The activities coordinator Jennifer bounced between tables like a cruise director, maintaining that aggressive cheerfulness that must be exhausting to sustain. The nursing staff moved with practiced efficiency, managing medications and monitoring residents with the kind of professional distance that comes from dealing with human needs as a daily routine. An elderly man named Frank sat down across from me without invitation, which I appreciated. Frank had the look of someone who'd been places and done things, and his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that some people never lose, regardless of their physical circumstances. "You're new?" he said, cutting into his meatloaf with more force than necessary. "Family decision?" "Something like that." He nodded knowingly. "Mine too. Daughter thinks I can't take care of myself because I forgot to turn off the stove once. Once. In 60 years of cooking. But she's got power of attorney now, so here I am." "How long have you been here?" 8 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. Not that I'm counting." He took a bite of meatloaf and made a face. "Food's terrible. Activities are insulting. And they treat us like children. But the worst part is the visiting policies." I looked up from my own untouched dinner. "What about them?" Frank's expression darkened. "They control everything. When people can visit, how long they can stay, where you can meet them. My grandson wanted to take me out for my birthday last month, just to lunch, nothing crazy, and they wouldn't allow it because it wasn't a pre-approved family outing. Said it was for my safety." The word safety again. The universal justification for taking away choice. "They make the families fill out forms in triplicate just to visit during off hours," Frank continued. "And forget about staying overnight anywhere. My daughter wanted me to spend Christmas at her house, but they said it would quote my care routine." I filed this information away, another piece of the puzzle I was assembling. Control mechanisms disguised as care protocols. Policies designed to keep families compliant rather than connected. "What about the management?" I asked. "Are they reasonable to deal with?" Frank snorted. "Reasonable if you like being patronized by people half your age who think dementia is contagious. The director, Mrs. Sullivan, runs this place like a minimum security prison. Everything's about liability and insurance coverage. Nothing's about actually living. After dinner, I excused myself and returned to my room, where I spent the evening reviewing the preliminary reports that Patricia's team had already begun compiling. Willowbrook Manor was owned by Golden Years Healthcare Corporation, which operated 17 similar facilities across 3 states. Golden Years was privately held but struggling financially, with occupancy rates declining and several facilities operating at losses. More interesting was the corporate structure. Golden Years was owned by a holding company called Sunset Investments, which was itself owned by a complex web of shell companies and investment groups. It was the kind of structure designed to obscure ownership and limit liability, but it also created opportunities for someone with enough capital and legal expertise to exploit weaknesses in the corporate governance. I made notes in the margins of the reports, identifying potential pressure points and acquisition strategies. This wasn't just about buying a nursing home. This was about understanding how to dismantle and rebuild a system that treated human dignity as a liability issue. My phone rang and Patricia's name appeared on the screen. "Cora, I've got some interesting news," she said, without preamble. "Golden Years Healthcare is in worse shape than we initially thought. They've got cash flow problems, several pending lawsuits, and they're behind on payments to some major suppliers. More importantly, Sunset Investments has been looking for an exit strategy for the past 18 months. What kind of exit strategy? They want to sell the whole portfolio. They're tired of dealing with healthcare regulations and liability issues, and they're looking for someone who wants to take over the headaches along with the assets." I smiled. Probably the first genuine smile I'd had since arriving at Willowbrook Manor. "What's their asking price?" $47 million for the entire chain. But given their financial position, I think we could negotiate them down significantly. $47 million. It was a substantial investment, but not outside my reach. And if I could acquire the entire chain rather than just one facility, the leverage would be exponentially greater. "Patricia, I want you to set up a meeting with Sunset Investments. But I want to approach this carefully. I don't want them to know I'm a resident at one of their facilities." "What's the timeline?" "As fast as legally possible." "And Patricia? I want this acquisition structured so that I have complete operational control from day one. No board oversight, no investor committees, no bureaucratic delays when I want to make changes." "That's going to be expensive. I don't care." "Sometimes the most expensive solution is also the most permanent one." After I hung up, I sat in my institutional armchair and looked around my beige room with new eyes. This wasn't just temporary housing anymore. This was my future corporate headquarters. This was the first domino in a chain reaction that would teach my children exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 5 decades turning impossible situations into opportunities. They thought they'd found the perfect solution to their inconvenient mother problem. What they'd actually done was provide me with the perfect laboratory for demonstrating the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. The next morning brought my first official wellness check with Dr. Morrison, and I approached it with the same preparation I'd once brought to hostile board meetings. I'd researched his background, Harvard Medical, solid credentials, 15 years in geriatric care, and I'd reviewed the standard assessment protocols for elderly residents entering assisted living facilities. Dr. Morrison turned out to be younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of earnest bedside manner that suggested he'd gone into medicine for the right reasons but had gotten worn down by the realities of institutional healthcare. His office was an attempt at warmth within the sterile confines of a medical facility, with family photos and motivational posters that didn't quite overcome the underlying smell of disinfectant and industrial carpet. "Mrs. Anderson, I hope you're settling in well," he said, consulting a thick file that presumably contained whatever information my children had provided about my condition. "I see here that your family has some concerns about recent changes in your behavior and memory." I kept my expression neutral while internally cataloging this as another data point in my children's systematic campaign to rewrite my competence narrative. "What kind of changes?" He flipped through the file and I caught glimpses of handwritten notes and printed forms. Confusion about dates and events, difficulty with routine tasks, some concerning incidents, including a recent fall. "Doctor, May I ask what specific incidents were reported to you? He looked uncomfortable, which told me that the incidents were probably as fabricated as I suspected. Well, there was mention of you forgetting important dates, misplacing personal items, and some difficulty managing your household responsibilities. I leaned forward slightly, using the body language I'd perfected in negotiations when I needed to establish credibility without appearing aggressive. Dr. Morrison, I'm curious about the source of this information. Did you speak directly with anyone who witnessed these incidents, or are you relying on secondhand reports? His discomfort increased. The information was provided by your family members during the intake process. It's standard procedure to gather background information from relatives who are concerned about a patient's well-being. I understand that. But as a medical professional, I assume you recognize the importance of verifying information that will influence treatment decisions. He set down the file and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd entered his office. I could see him reevaluating, adjusting his assumptions about the elderly woman sitting across from him. Mrs. Anderson, what's your perspective on these concerns? Finally, a question that treated me like a person rather than a diagnosis. My perspective is that my children have confused their convenience with my safety. I fell in my kitchen because the floor was wet, not because I'm cognitively impaired. I questioned some of their financial inquiries because they were inappropriate, not because I was confused about current events. And I chose to live independently because I value my autonomy, not because I was unable to manage household responsibilities. Doctor? Morrison made notes, and I could see him reconsidering the narrative he'd been given. This was good. I needed allies in this place, and a doctor who was willing to question assumptions would be valuable. We went through the standard cognitive assessments, physical examinations, and medical history reviews. I answered every question clearly and accurately, demonstrating the kind of mental acuity that would be hard to dismiss as compromised. When we finished, Dr. Morrison sat back in his chair and studied my file again. Mrs. Anderson, I have to say that my examination doesn't support the level of concern that was expressed during your intake process. Your cognitive function appears to be well within normal ranges for someone your age, your physical health is quite good, and you don't present any of the warning signs we typically see in patients who require intensive supervision. I nodded, unsurprised but pleased to have professional confirmation. So what happens now? I'm going to recommend that you be classified for minimal assistance rather than the comprehensive care package that was initially requested. That will give you more freedom within the facility and fewer restrictions on your activities and movement. It was a small victory, but an important one. More freedom meant more opportunity to observe operations, build relationships, and position myself for what came next. Dr. Morrison, may I ask you a question about the facility's policies? Of course. I've heard that there are significant restrictions on resident interactions with family members, visiting schedules, overnight stays, outside activities. Can you explain the reasoning behind those policies? He shifted in his chair, and I could see that I'd touched on something that made him uncomfortable. The policies are designed to ensure resident safety and maintain care continuity. When residents leave the facility or have irregular schedules, it can disrupt medical routines and create liability issues. But surely there's room for flexibility when residents are cognitively intact and physically capable? In theory, yes. In practice, he trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. Mrs. Anderson, can I speak frankly? Please do. Many of the policies here are driven more by liability concerns and administrative convenience than by what's actually best for residents. The management prioritizes compliance and documentation over individual needs, and the staff is often caught in the middle. This was exactly the kind of insider perspective I needed. That must be frustrating for someone who went into medicine to help people. It is. I've tried to advocate for more flexible policies, especially for residents who are here more for family convenience than medical necessity, but the administration is very risk-averse. I filed this information away along with everything else I was learning about Willowbrook Manor's operations. Dr. Morrison was confirming what Frank had told me and what I was observing on my own. This place was run like an institution first and a home second, with policies designed to protect the facility rather than serve the residents. As I left Dr. Morrison's office, I felt more confident about the path I was taking. I wasn't just going to buy this place, I was going to revolutionize it. And in the process, I was going to demonstrate to my children exactly what it looks like when someone who actually cares about dignity and autonomy gets to make the rules. That afternoon, I received a call from Patricia with news that accelerated my timeline considerably. Cora, Sunset Investments wants to meet. They're more motivated to sell than I initially thought, and they're willing to consider a cash offer significantly below asking price. How significantly? $32 million for the entire chain, with a 60-day closing period. I did quick mental calculations. $32 million would require liquidating some long-term investments, but it was absolutely manageable. And 60 days meant I could have operational control of Willowbrook Manor before my children even realized what was happening. Set up the meeting, I said. And Patricia? I want this acquisition structured as a complete buyout with immediate operational control. No transition period. No consulting agreements with the current management. When I own this company, I want to be able to make changes starting on day one. That's going to require some creative structuring, but I think it's doable. Good. Because I have some very specific changes I want to make, and I don't want to wait for anyone's permission to implement them. After we hung up, I sat in my beige room and began making lists. Changes I wanted to make to visiting policies. Staff training programs I wanted to implement. Quality of life improvements that would transform this place from an institution into something that actually deserved the word home. But first, I needed to complete my acquisition. And for that, I needed to make sure my children had no idea what was coming until it was too late for them to interfere. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to my accountant, outlining the financial transfers I needed to complete before the Sunset Investments meeting. 47 years of building wealth, and I was about to deploy a significant portion of it in service of a single goal, proving that dignity and autonomy aren't privileges that disappear when you reach a certain age. My children thought they'd solved their problem by putting me somewhere safe and manageable. What they'd actually done was give me the perfect opportunity to show them the difference between being cared for and being controlled. And by the time I was finished restructuring their visiting privileges, they were going to understand exactly what it feels like to have someone else make decisions about when and how they could see the people they claimed to love. The meeting with Sunset Investments took place in a gleaming conference room on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Tower, overlooking the city I'd spent decades helping to build. I sat across from 3 executives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, flanked by Patricia and 2 additional lawyers I'd retained specifically for complex healthcare acquisitions. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my children thought I was safely tucked away in their chosen facility, I was actually negotiating to buy the entire company that owned it. Richard Thornton, Sunset's managing partner, was a man in his 50s who wore his stress in the tight lines around his eyes and the way his fingers drummed constantly against the mahogany table. He'd clearly expected this to be a routine transaction with some faceless investment group, not a personal meeting with a woman old enough to be his mother. Mrs. Anderson, he began, consulting his notes with the air of someone who was already mentally spending his commission. I understand you're interested in acquiring our healthcare portfolio. I have to say, it's unusual for an individual investor to take on this kind of liability and operational complexity. I smiled the same smile I'd used in countless negotiations when someone underestimated me based on appearances. Mr. Thornton, I've been making unusual investments for 47 years. It's served me quite well. Patricia slid a folder across the table containing our preliminary offer and acquisition terms. I watched Thornton's expression change as he reviewed the numbers, his drumming fingers going still as he realized this wasn't a fishing expedition or preliminary inquiry. $32 million, all cash, 60-day closing, he read aloud, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. Mrs. Anderson, this is a serious offer. I don't make unserious offers, Mr. Thornton. The woman to his left, introduced as Sandra Mills, their chief financial officer, leaned forward with barely concealed eagerness. The timeline is aggressive, but manageable. What's your intention for the facilities post-acquisition? This was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether they'd view me as a solution to their problems or a potential complication. I'd prepared for this moment carefully, crafting an answer that was truthful without being complete. I'm interested in restructuring operations to focus on resident satisfaction and quality of care rather than just regulatory compliance. I believe there's significant value in creating facilities that people actually want to live in, rather than places families feel obligated to use. It was exactly what they wanted to hear. Healthcare companies love talking about quality of care and resident satisfaction, especially when someone else is offering to take on the liability and operational headaches. The third executive, James Chen, spoke up for the first time. "What's your background in healthcare management?" "I don't have one," I said honestly. "But I have extensive experience in operational restructuring and turning underperforming assets into profitable enterprises. I'm not interested in running these facilities myself. I'm interested in hiring the right people and giving them the resources and autonomy to do their jobs properly." Over the next 2 hours, we dissected every aspect of the deal. Financial projections, regulatory requirements, staffing challenges, insurance obligations. I let my lawyers handle most of the technical questions, while I focused on demonstrating that I understood exactly what I was buying and why. What I didn't tell them was that I'd spent the past week conducting my own comprehensive audit of their operations. I'd hired private investigators to visit each of their 17 facilities, posing as potential family members evaluating care options for elderly relatives. I'd had forensic accountants review their public filings and identify patterns in their financial management. I'd even had former employees interviewed about working conditions and management practices. The picture that emerged was exactly what I'd expected. A company that had prioritized profit margins over everything else, cutting corners on staffing, maintenance, and resident services, while maximizing occupancy rates and insurance reimbursements. It was the kind of operation that could be dramatically improved with proper investment and management, but more importantly for my purposes, it was the kind of operation that gave me significant leverage for implementing immediate changes. By the end of the meeting, we'd agreed on terms that exceeded my expectations. $31 million, 50-day closing, with immediate operational control upon transfer of funds. No consultation requirements with current management. No retention agreements for existing executives. No restrictions on policy changes or operational restructuring. As we shook hands and exchanged contact information for our respective legal teams, Richard Thornton made a comment that almost made me laugh out loud. "Mrs. Anderson, I have to say, it's refreshing to work with someone who understands that healthcare is ultimately a business. Too many people get caught up in the emotional aspects and lose sight of practical realities." If he only knew that the emotional aspects were exactly what I was buying this company to address, and that his definition of practical realities was about to be completely redefined. Patricia and I celebrated with coffee at a small cafe near the Columbia Tower, reviewing the terms and timeline while I mentally calculated how long I could keep this acquisition secret from my children. "Cora, I have to ask," Patricia said, stirring sugar into her latte, "what's your real plan here? I know you well enough to know that this isn't just about improving nursing home operations." I looked out the window at the afternoon traffic, at people hurrying to appointments and obligations that they controlled, making choices about how to spend their time and where to go and who to see. Simple freedoms that my children had decided I no longer deserved. "Patricia, have you ever had someone make decisions about your life without consulting you? Have you ever been told that your own judgment about your own needs couldn't be trusted?" "No, I haven't." "My children think they saved me from myself by putting me in Willowbrook Manor. They think they solved a problem and protected me from imaginary dangers. What they actually did was demonstrate that they don't understand the difference between caring for someone and controlling them." Patricia nodded slowly, beginning to understand the deeper motivation behind this acquisition. "When I own Golden Years Healthcare, I'm going to implement policies that restore dignity and autonomy to people who've been systematically stripped of both. I'm going to prove that safety and freedom aren't mutually exclusive, and that treating elderly people like children doesn't protect them, it diminishes them. And your children? My children are going to learn that underestimating someone based on age is just as foolish as underestimating them based on any other characteristic. They're going to discover that putting someone in a cage doesn't make them powerless, it just makes them more motivated to break out." That evening, I returned to Willowbrook Manor with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in months. Everything looked the same. The institutional beige walls, the safety-approved furniture, the laminated schedules posted on every bulletin board. But I saw it all differently now. This wasn't my prison. It was my future headquarters. I attended dinner in the communal dining room, engaging in conversations with other residents that I'd been too angry to appreciate before. Frank was there, of course, still complaining about the meatloaf and the visiting restrictions. But tonight I listened with the ears of someone who would soon be in a position to address his concerns. At the table next to mine, an elderly woman named Dorothy was crying quietly, while a nursing aide tried to console her. I caught fragments of their conversation, something about her grandson's wedding, and how she wouldn't be able to attend because it conflicted with her physical therapy schedule, and the facility didn't allow overnight absences for non-medical family events. I introduced myself to Dorothy after dinner, and she told me her story through tears of frustration rather than sadness. Her grandson was getting married in 3 weeks, a destination wedding in California that her family had been planning for over a year. Dorothy had been looking forward to it for months, had already bought a dress, and helped plan some of the pre-wedding events. But when her daughter brought her to Willowbrook Manor 6 months ago after a minor car accident, the facility's policies had gradually restricted her freedom until now she couldn't even attend the most important family event of the year. "They say it's for my safety," Dorothy said, echoing the familiar refrain. "But I've been traveling longer than most of these staff members have been alive. I don't need a babysitter to attend my own grandson's wedding." I listened to her story and thought about all the other stories like it, all the other residents who'd been separated from the people and events that gave their lives meaning in the name of policies that prioritized institutional convenience over human connection. "Dorothy," I said, "what if I told you that these policies might be changing soon?" She looked at me with the skeptical expression of someone who'd heard too many empty promises. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes facilities need new management to remember that residents are people, not liability issues. And sometimes that change happens faster than anyone expects." I couldn't tell her what I was planning, not yet, but I could plant the seed of hope while I worked behind the scenes to make it reality. Over the following weeks, I maintained the careful balance of appearing to settle into facility life while secretly orchestrating the most complex acquisition of my career. I attended their scheduled activities with good humor, participated in the condescending chair yoga classes, and even joined Frank's investment club that didn't actually invest in anything. But my real work happened in my room, on calls with Patricia and my financial team, reviewing contracts and regulatory requirements, and operational restructuring plans. I learned about healthcare licensing, Medicare reimbursement procedures, and the labyrinthine regulations that governed everything from staffing ratios to fire safety protocols. Most importantly, I studied the existing policies at all 17 Golden Years facilities, identifying the ones that needed immediate revision and the ones that needed to be completely eliminated. Visiting restrictions, overnight stay prohibitions, safety protocols that prevented residents from making basic choices about their own lives. I compiled a comprehensive list of changes that would restore dignity and autonomy while still maintaining genuine safety standards. I also began discreetly building relationships with key staff members at Willowbrook Manor, particularly those who seemed frustrated with current policies but powerless to change them. Dr. Morrison was an obvious ally, but I also identified sympathetic nurses, activity coordinators, and even some administrative staff who understood the difference between caring for residents and controlling them. Jennifer, the activities coordinator, who'd initially struck me as aggressively cheerful, turned out to be genuinely committed to improving residents' quality of life. During one of our conversations about potential new programs, she confided her frustration with policies that prevented her from organizing meaningful activities. "I wanted to arrange a field trip to the art museum last month," she told me as we sat in the facility's garden. "But administration said it was too much liability, too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. So instead, we had someone come here to give a slide presentation about art." "Not quite the same experience," I observed. "Not at all. These people spent their whole lives going places and doing things and making choices, and now we act like they're too fragile to leave the building. It's heartbreaking." I filed Jennifer's contact information under potential allies and continued building my understanding of how the facility actually operated versus how it was supposed to operate according to policy manuals. 3 weeks into my secret acquisition process, I received an unexpected visit from Marcus and Samantha. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon during what the facility called open visiting hours, though their definition of open was fairly restrictive. I was in the garden when they found me, reading a book and enjoying what passed for privacy in a place where staff members checked on residents every 2 hours. For safety purposes. Marcus was carrying a small gift bag, and Samantha had her phone out, probably documenting their dutiful visit for whatever audience appreciated their performance of filial devotion. "Mom, you look great," Marcus said, settling onto the bench beside me with the kind of careful positioning that suggested he didn't plan to stay long. "How are you settling in?" I studied my son's face, searching for any genuine concern beneath the obligatory pleasantries. "I'm adjusting, learning the rhythms of institutional life." Samantha looked up from her phone, where she'd been taking photos of me in my garden setting. "Are you making friends? Jennifer mentioned that you've been participating in activities." The fact that they'd been talking to Jennifer about my adjustment was interesting but not surprising. They probably wanted regular updates to confirm that their solution was working, that I was safely contained and adapting to my new circumstances. "I've met some interesting people," I said carefully. "Lots of stories, lots of experience that's being underutilized." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing something in my tone that didn't quite fit the narrative of grateful elderly mother accepting necessary care. "We brought you some things," he said, handing me the gift bag. "Books, some of your favorite tea, a new photo album for pictures." I accepted the gifts with appropriate gratitude, while mentally noting that they were all items designed to help me create a nice, contained life within these walls. Books to read in my room, tea to drink during facility-approved social hours, photo albums to fill with memories of visits rather than experiences. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." I paused, then decided to probe a little. "I've been wondering about something. When you were making the decision to bring me here, did you consider any alternatives?" Samantha and Marcus exchanged glances, the kind of quick communication that happens between siblings who've coordinated their story. "Mom, we looked at lots of options," Samantha said. "Home care services, adult day programs, moving you closer to one of us. But after the fall, and with some of the confusion you'd been experiencing, this seemed like the safest choice." There was that word again. Safe. The universal justification for taking away choice. "I see. And you're satisfied with the care here? With the policies and procedures?" Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Dr. Morrison says you're doing well, and the staff has been nothing but professional. We feel much better knowing you're somewhere safe." I wondered what they'd think when they discovered that their safe solution was about to become my platform for demonstrating exactly what real care looked like when it wasn't filtered through liability concerns and administrative convenience. We chatted for another 20 minutes about inconsequential things. The weather, family news, Marcus's work projects, before they began making the subtle gestures that indicated their visit was coming to an end. Checking phones, mentioning other commitments, the gradual emotional withdrawal that precedes physical departure. As they prepared to leave, Samantha hugged me with what felt like genuine affection. And for a moment, I remembered the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. "We love you, Mom," she said. "We know this was a big adjustment, but we really think this is best for everyone. Best for everyone." Another way of saying that my needs had been weighed against their convenience and found wanting. After they left, I sat in the garden for another hour, thinking about the phone call I would make to Patricia that evening to confirm that our acquisition timeline was still on track. In less than 3 weeks, I would own the company that employed every staff member my children had just praised. The company that created every policy they'd just endorsed. I thought about the conversation I would eventually have with them, about the difference between loving someone and controlling them, about the difference between protection and imprisonment, about the difference between safety and dignity. But first, I had to finish buying their carefully chosen solution and transforming it into something that actually deserved the word care. That evening, I called Patricia from my room, speaking quietly even though the walls were thick enough to provide reasonable privacy. "How are we progressing?" I asked. "Faster than expected. Sunset is motivated to close quickly, and all the regulatory approvals are moving smoothly. We should be able to complete the acquisition in 2 weeks, rather than the full 50 days we negotiated." 2 weeks. It was sooner than I dared hope, but it created some logistical challenges for implementing changes without alerting my children prematurely. "Patricia, I want to be very careful about how we handle the transition." I don't want current management or staff to know about the ownership change until I'm ready to announce it myself. That's going to require some creative structuring, but it's doable. We can set up the acquisition through a management company that maintains operational continuity until you're ready to reveal yourself as the actual owner. Perfect. And I want to have a comprehensive policy revision package ready to implement immediately after the announcement. New visiting procedures, activity guidelines, resident autonomy protocols, everything we've discussed. I'll have the legal team draft everything this week. Cora, are you sure you want to move this quickly? Major operational changes usually require more gradual implementation. I looked around my beige room, thinking about Dorothy crying over her grandson's wedding, about Frank's frustration with patronizing activities, about Dr. Morrison's desire to practice medicine instead of risk management. Patricia, I've been living with these policies for weeks now. I've seen how they affect real people in real situations. The current system isn't just inefficient, it's dehumanizing. Fast change isn't riskier than slow change when the status quo is actively harmful. Understood. I'll make sure everything is ready for rapid implementation. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and began drafting what I privately called the dignity protocols, the comprehensive policy changes that would transform Golden Years Healthcare from an institutional warehouse into something that actually honored the intelligence and autonomy of its residents. Visiting policies would be restructured to prioritize family connection over administrative convenience. Residents in good health would be able to have overnight guests, attend family events, and even travel with relatives without bureaucratic obstacles designed to protect the facility rather than serve the residents. Activity programs would be redesigned to offer meaningful engagement rather than condescending entertainment. Instead of chair yoga and fake investment clubs, there would be real learning opportunities, genuine social connections, and activities that acknowledged that many residents had decades of experience and expertise to share. Most importantly, there would be clear protocols establishing that competent residents had the right to make informed decisions about their own lives, even when those decisions involved reasonable risks. The word safety would no longer be used as a blanket justification for taking away choice. I worked on these protocols until well past midnight, fine-tuning language and anticipating implementation challenges. This wasn't just about improving one nursing home. It was about creating a model that could be replicated across the entire healthcare industry. But it was also deeply personal. Every policy I wrote, every procedure I revised, was informed by my own experience of having my autonomy stripped away by people who claimed to love me but couldn't distinguish between caring for me and controlling me. 10 days later, Patricia called with the news I'd been waiting for. It's done. As of this morning, you own Golden Years Healthcare Corporation and all 17 of its facilities. Congratulations, Cora. You're now in the nursing home business. I was sitting in the Willowbrook Manor dining room when I took the call, surrounded by residents eating their lunch and staff members going through their daily routines, completely unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. When can I make the announcement? I asked. Whenever you're ready. All the legal requirements have been met, and you have full operational authority as of right now. I looked around the dining room, at Frank stabbing his salad with unnecessary force, at Dorothy sitting alone at a corner table, at Jennifer, trying to generate enthusiasm for an afternoon craft project that no one really wanted to do. Schedule a facility-wide meeting for tomorrow morning. Staff and residents. I want everyone to hear about the changes at the same time. What about your children? I smiled, probably the first genuinely joyful expression I'd had since arriving at Willowbrook Manor 6 weeks ago. My children will find out when everyone else finds out. I think it's time they learned what it feels like to be surprised by someone else's decisions about their life. That night, I barely slept, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Tomorrow morning, I would stand in front of the people who had been treating me as a liability to be managed and reveal that I was actually their new owner. I would announce policy changes that would restore dignity and autonomy to every resident in the facility. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already planning the conversation I would eventually have with Marcus and Samantha about the difference between love and control, about the difference between protection and respect, about the difference between safety and dignity, They thought they'd solved their inconvenient mother problem by putting me somewhere safe and manageable. What they'd actually done was provide me with the perfect platform to demonstrate what real care looked like when it prioritized human dignity over institutional convenience. I fell asleep that night thinking about Dorothy's grandson's wedding and how she was going to attend it after all. About Frank's investment club that was going to start making real investments. About all the ways that tomorrow was going to change everything for people who had been told that change wasn't possible at their age. My children had wanted to put me somewhere they could control my access to my resources and my independence. Instead, they'd given me front row seats to study an industry that needed revolutionizing, and now I owned the perfect laboratory for implementing that revolution. Tomorrow morning, the real education would begin, and this time, I would be the one doing the teaching. The morning of my announcement, I woke before dawn and dressed in the navy blue business suit I'd had Patricia bring from my penthouse closet. I wanted to look like the woman who had built Anderson Capital Management, not like the diminished version of myself that my children had convinced everyone I'd become. I applied makeup carefully, styled my hair with precision, and chose jewelry that conveyed authority without ostentation. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the CEO I'd always been, temporarily disguised as a nursing home resident. The facility-wide meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main recreation room, with attendance mandatory for all staff and optional for residents. I had specifically requested that no one be told the purpose of the meeting, only that it concerned important operational changes. I wanted to see their faces when they realized exactly who had been living among them for the past 6 weeks. I arrived at the recreation room 15 minutes early and positioned myself near the back, observing as staff members filed in with the weary resignation of people expecting another round of bureaucratic announcements about policy changes they couldn't control. The nurses looked tired, the activity coordinators looked skeptical, and the administrative staff looked nervous in the way that suggested they thought someone was about to be fired. Dr. Morrison entered and nodded at me with the friendly acknowledgement we'd developed since my wellness check. He had no idea that in a few minutes, I would be announcing myself as his new employer. Jennifer bounced in with her characteristic enthusiasm, probably hoping this meeting would bring news of expanded programming or increased resources. Frank shuffled to a seat near the front, muttering something about how these meetings were always about taking things away, never about giving residents more options. Dorothy sat alone in the middle section, looking smaller and more fragile than usual. I knew she'd been struggling since her family's last visit, when they'd confirmed that she wouldn't be able to attend her grandson's wedding because of the facility's inflexible policies. She'd stopped participating in most activities and spent increasing amounts of time in her room, grieving not just the wedding she'd miss, but the life she felt slipping away from her one policy at a time. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mrs. Sullivan, the facility director, entered with a woman I didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase that suggested legal or corporate authority. Mrs. Sullivan looked nervous in a way that went beyond normal meeting anxiety, and I realized that she'd probably been told just enough to know that major changes were coming without knowing what those changes would be. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Sullivan began, her voice carrying the false cheer that administrators use when they're delivering news they don't fully understand. "Thank you all for taking time from your schedules to attend this important meeting. We have some significant announcements regarding the future of Willowbrook Manor and our entire healthcare network." She gestured to the woman beside her. "This is Margaret Walsh from Walsh & Associates, representing the new ownership of Golden Years Healthcare Corporation. She'll be explaining the transition and introducing us to our new leadership structure." Margaret Walsh stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone who delivered similar announcements dozens of times before. She was probably in her 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of precise diction that came from years of corporate communications. "Thank you, Mrs. Tylos Sullivan. As of yesterday morning, Golden Years Healthcare Corporation has been acquired by Anderson Holdings, LLC. This acquisition includes all 17 facilities in our network, including Willowbrook Manor. The new owner has requested the opportunity to address the staff and residents personally regarding her vision for operational improvements and policy changes." A murmur went through the room as people processed this information. Ownership changes in healthcare facilities were usually routine affairs, but personal addresses from new owners were unusual enough to generate curiosity and concern in equal measure. Margaret Walsh looked directly at me and smiled. "Mrs. Anderson, would you like to come forward?" The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Morrison's jaw dropped open. Jennifer's eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been delight. Frank turned in his chair to stare at me with an expression of pure amazement. Mrs. Sullivan looked like she might faint. I stood slowly and walked to the front of the room, savoring every step of the journey from anonymous nursing home resident to revealed business owner. The silence was complete, broken only by the sound of my heels on the linoleum floor and the distant hum of medical equipment in adjacent rooms. When I reached the podium, I looked out at the assembled crowd and saw my reflection in their stunned faces. 6 weeks ago, these people had seen me as just another elderly woman whose family had decided she needed institutional care. Now they were trying to reconcile that image with the reality of someone who had just purchased their employer. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed over 4 decades of commanding boardrooms. For those who don't know me personally, my name is Cora Anderson, and as of yesterday I am the owner of Golden Years Healthcare Corporation and all of its facilities. The murmur grew louder as people turned to their neighbors, whispering confirmations of what they'd just heard. I let the noise continue for a moment, before raising my hand for silence. I'm sure you're wondering how someone who has been living as a resident at this facility for the past 6 weeks managed to purchase the company that owns it. The answer is simple. My children made the mistake of underestimating both my capabilities and my resources when they decided I needed to be managed rather than respected. I could see understanding dawning on several faces as people began to grasp the full implications of what had happened. This wasn't just a routine ownership change. This was a demonstration of power that had been carefully planned and flawlessly executed. Over the past 6 weeks, I've had the opportunity to observe this facility's operations from a unique perspective. I've experienced your policies, procedures, and protocols as someone they were designed to control rather than serve. I've watched dedicated staff members struggle with regulations that prioritize institutional liability over individual dignity. And I've seen too many residents accept limitations on their freedom that have nothing to do with safety and everything to do with administrative convenience. Dr. Morrison was nodding slowly, beginning to understand why I'd asked so many pointed questions about facility policies during our conversations. Jennifer looked like she was suppressing a smile, probably remembering her complaints about field trip restrictions and meaningless activities. Today marks the beginning of comprehensive changes to how we operate. These changes are based on a simple principle. Competent adults don't lose their right to make informed decisions about their own lives, simply because they require assistance with certain tasks. I gestured to Margaret Walsh, who began distributing packets of documents to the staff members. What you're receiving is a complete revision of our resident policies, activity programs, and family interaction protocols. These changes take effect immediately, and I expect full implementation within 72 hours. Mrs. Sullivan raised her hand tentatively. Mrs. Anderson, these kinds of policy changes usually require regulatory review and gradual implementation. The liability implications. I cut her off with the kind of firm directness I'd used to shut down countless attempts to slow down necessary changes. Mrs. Sullivan, I've had these policies reviewed by healthcare attorneys, regulatory specialists, and insurance experts. Every change we're implementing meets or exceeds all required safety standards while eliminating restrictions that serve no purpose other than administrative convenience. The liability implications have been thoroughly analyzed and addressed. I turned my attention back to the full audience. Let me give you some specific examples of what's changing. Effective immediately, residents in good health will be able to have overnight guests in their apartments. Family members will be able to visit during any reasonable hours without advance notice or bureaucratic approval processes. Residents will be able to attend family events, take trips with relatives, and participate in community activities outside this facility without requiring medical justification. The excitement in the room was palpable. I could see staff members flipping through the policy documents with expressions of amazement, and several residents were leaning forward in their chairs with renewed interest in their surroundings. Our activity programs will be completely restructured to offer genuine learning opportunities and meaningful engagement. We'll have real investment clubs with actual portfolios, educational seminars led by residents who are experts in various fields, and cultural trips to museums, theaters, and other venues that treat our residents as intelligent adults rather than children who need to be entertained. Frank raised his hand, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. Mrs. Anderson, does this mean we can actually make investment decisions in the investment club? Mr. Hoffman, it means you can do whatever competent adults do when they pool their resources and expertise. If that includes making real investments, then yes, you can make real investments. I saw tears forming in Frank's eyes as he absorbed the implications of being treated like the successful businessman he'd been for 40 years before his daughter decided he needed to be managed like a child. Dorothy, I said, looking directly at the elderly woman who'd been grieving her lost opportunity to attend her grandson's wedding. How would you like to fly to California next week for a wedding? Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth, and I could see her struggling to believe what she was hearing. But the policies, the insurance, the medical supervision requirements. Dorothy, you're a competent adult who's been traveling independently for 70 years. If you want to attend your grandson's wedding, the only thing stopping you is your own decision about whether you feel physically capable of making the trip. This facility's job is to support your choices, not make them for you. The room erupted in applause, and I had to wait several minutes for the noise to die down before I could continue. When I looked at the faces around me, I saw hope replacing resignation, excitement replacing frustration, and dignity replacing the institutional diminishment that had been slowly crushing the spirits of people who deserved so much better. I want to be clear about something, I continued once the room was quiet again. These changes aren't about eliminating safety measures or abandoning our responsibility to provide appropriate care. They're about distinguishing between genuine safety concerns and administrative convenience disguised as protection. They're about treating our residents as the intelligent, experienced adults they are, rather than as liability issues to be managed. I gestured to Dr. Morrison, who was still processing the magnitude of what was happening. Dr. Morrison, you'll be working with an expanded medical team that includes specialists in geriatric medicine who understand the difference between necessary medical intervention and overprotective policies that diminish quality of life. You'll have the resources and authority to make medical decisions based on individual patient needs rather than blanket institutional restrictions. Dr. Morrison stood up, and I could see the relief and gratitude in his expression. Mrs. Anderson, this is exactly what we've needed. The current system forces us to practice defensive medicine rather than personalized care. Jennifer, I said, turning to the activities coordinator, you'll be working with a significantly expanded budget and complete freedom to design programs that actually interest and challenge our residents. No more chair yoga unless people specifically request it. No more slide presentations about art when we can arrange actual museum visits. Jennifer was beaming now, probably already planning the field trips and genuine learning opportunities she'd been wanting to organize for months. For our nursing and support staff, these changes mean you'll be able to focus on actual caregiving rather than documentation and liability management. You'll have better staffing ratios, higher wages, and the satisfaction of working in a facility that treats both residents and employees with the respect they deserve. The applause this time was sustained and enthusiastic, and I could see that the initial shock was being replaced by excitement and anticipation. These people had been working within a system that frustrated their genuine desire to provide good care, and suddenly they were being told that system was about to change in ways that would allow them to do their jobs properly. Now, I said, allowing my voice to take on a slightly harder edge, I want to address the elephant in the room. Some of you are probably wondering about my children's role in this situation. Marcus and Samantha Anderson believed they were acting in my best interests when they brought me here. They thought they were protecting me from imaginary dangers and managing my declining capabilities. The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were about to witness a reckoning that went far beyond policy changes and operational improvements. What they actually did was demonstrate that they never understood who I am, or what I'm capable of. They made the fundamental error of confusing age with incompetence, and they're about to learn that underestimating someone based on stereotypes is always a mistake. I looked around the room, making eye contact with staff members who had been treating me as just another elderly resident for the past 6 weeks. My children thought they could control my access to my resources and my independence by putting me somewhere safe and manageable. Instead, they provided me with the perfect opportunity to study an industry that needed revolutionizing, and to acquire the platform necessary to implement that revolution. Margaret Walsh stepped forward with another set of documents. Mrs. Anderson, should we proceed with the individual staff meetings to discuss specific implementation details? I nodded. Yes, but first I want to make one final point to everyone here. What we're doing isn't just about improving one nursing home or even one healthcare network. We're creating a model that demonstrates how elderly care can prioritize dignity and autonomy, while still providing excellent medical support and genuine safety measures. I paused, looking at the faces around me and seeing the hope and excitement that had replaced the resignation and frustration that had characterized this place for too long. We're proving that caring for people and controlling them are not the same thing. We're showing that respect and protection can coexist. And we're demonstrating that age is not a disqualifying characteristic for intelligence, autonomy, or the right to make decisions about your own life. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, and as I stood there accepting it, I thought about the phone calls I would need to make that afternoon. Marcus and Samantha would need to be informed about these developments, and I was very much looking forward to their reactions when they realized that their carefully managed solution had become my platform for demonstrating exactly what real care looked like. But first, I had a healthcare network to revolutionize and a wedding in California to arrange for Dorothy. The individual staff meetings took most of the afternoon, as I worked with department heads to implement the new policies and address specific operational questions. Dr. Morrison was effusive in his gratitude for the expanded medical team and the freedom to practice personalized medicine rather than defensive protocols. Jennifer was already planning field trips and educational programs that would challenge and engage residents rather than patronize them. Mrs. Sullivan, the facility director, seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the changes, but gradually warmed to the new approach as she began to understand how much more rewarding her job would become when she could focus on resident satisfaction rather than liability management. Mrs. Anderson, she said during our private meeting, I have to ask about your children. Are they aware of what you've done here? I smiled, anticipating the conversation I would have with Marcus and Samantha in just a few hours. Mrs. Sullivan, my children are about to receive an education about the difference between love and control, between protection and respect, between safety and dignity. They thought they were solving a problem by putting me here. They're about to discover that they were actually providing me with the perfect opportunity to solve much bigger problems than they ever imagined. At 4 o'clock, I returned to my apartment and placed the call I'd been anticipating for weeks. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who thought all the difficult decisions had already been made. Hi, Mom. How are you settling in today? I'm doing very well, Marcus. In fact, I have some news that I think will interest you. Oh? What kind of news? I looked around my beige apartment, which tomorrow would be redecorated according to my preferences rather than institutional requirements, and smiled. The kind of news that happens when someone underestimates what a 73-year-old woman with 47 years of business experience is capable of accomplishing. There was a pause, and I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Mom, what are you talking about? Marcus, I'm talking about the fact that as of yesterday morning, I own Willowbrook Manor and the 16 other facilities in the Golden Years Healthcare Network. I'm talking about comprehensive policy changes that will restore dignity and autonomy to every resident in every facility. And I'm talking about a conversation you and your sister and I need to have about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. The silence that followed was exactly what I'd expected. Complete, stunned, disbelieving silence. That's impossible, he finally said, his voice shaking. You don't have access to. You can't just. Mom, that's not possible. Marcus, I've been making impossible investments for 47 years. This one was particularly satisfying because it allowed me to turn your solution into my demonstration of what real care looks like when it prioritizes human dignity over administrative convenience. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably trying to process the implications of what I was telling him. But where did you get the money, we thought, the facility said. You thought what, Marcus? That being in a nursing home would somehow eliminate my access to my assets? That age had made me incompetent to manage my own affairs? That putting me somewhere you considered safe would make me powerless? The silence stretched longer this time, and I knew he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Mom, We were trying to protect you. We were worried about your safety, your health, your ability to live independently after the fall. Marcus, you were trying to manage me. There's a difference between protection and control, between safety and imprisonment, between love and convenience. And now you're going to learn what that difference looks like. I heard another phone pick up, and Samantha's voice joined the conversation. Mom? Marcus called me. What's this about you buying the nursing home? Hello, Samantha. It's about the fact that your carefully chosen solution to your inconvenient mother problem has become my platform for revolutionizing an entire industry. It's about the fact that while you thought you were limiting my options, I was actually expanding them in ways you never imagined possible. But Mom, Samantha said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd used when she was trying to convince me that Willowbrook Manor was for my own good, even if you could somehow afford this, it's not a reasonable investment. Healthcare facilities are complicated, heavily regulated, and require specialized management expertise. I laughed, the first genuinely joyful sound I'd made in months. Samantha, I've been observing the management of this facility from the inside for 6 weeks. I've seen exactly how complicated and heavily regulated it is, and I've identified numerous ways to improve operations while reducing costs and increasing resident satisfaction. This isn't an emotional purchase. It's a strategic investment in an industry that desperately needs someone who understands the difference between genuine care and institutional control. Marcus found his voice again. Mom, this is crazy. You can't just buy a nursing home because you're angry about some policies. There are legal requirements, insurance issues, staffing problems. Marcus, I can and I have. The acquisition was completed yesterday morning with full regulatory approval and comprehensive legal review. As we speak, new policies are being implemented that will restore dignity and autonomy to residents while maintaining all necessary safety standards. Your concerns about my competence and decision-making ability have been addressed by 47 years of successful business management and a healthcare acquisition that was executed flawlessly in under 2 months. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This was the silence of people realizing that their assumptions had been completely wrong, that their solution had backfired spectacularly, and that they were dealing with someone far more capable and resourceful than they had ever imagined. What happens now? Samantha asked, her voice small and uncertain. Now, you learn what it feels like to have someone else make decisions about your access to the people you claim to love. Now, you discover what it's like to navigate policies and procedures that prioritize institutional convenience over personal relationships. Now, you experience what I've been experiencing for the past 6 weeks. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Effective immediately, your visiting privileges at Willowbrook Manor will be subject to the same restrictions that other families have been dealing with under the old policies. You'll need to submit requests 48 hours in advance for any visits outside of standard visiting hours. Overnight stays will require medical justification. Taking me off the premises will require approval from the medical staff and administration. Mom, that's not fair, Marcus protested. We're your children. Marcus, fairness is exactly what this is about. For the past 6 weeks, I've watched families struggle with policies that separated them from their loved ones, for no reason other than administrative convenience. Dorothy has been unable to attend her grandson's wedding because of inflexible overnight stay policies. Frank hasn't been able to have dinner with his son because of arbitrary visiting hour restrictions. Dozens of residents have been isolated from the people and activities that give their lives meaning, all in the name of safety and liability management. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the grounds that I now owned, and would be transforming according to my vision of what real care looked like. You wanted me to experience what it felt like to have other people make decisions about my safety and my access to my life. Now you get to experience what it feels like to have those same policies applied to your access to me. But Mom, Samantha said, we were trying to help you. We love you, and we were worried about you living alone after the fall. We thought this was the best option for everyone. Samantha, I'm sure you did think this was the best option for everyone. The problem is that you never asked me what I thought was best for me. You never considered whether I might be capable of making informed decisions about my own safety and independence. You assumed that age had made me incompetent, and you acted on that assumption without ever testing whether it was true. I walked back to my chair and sat down, preparing for the most important part of this conversation. Now you get to learn what I've learned over the past 6 weeks. You get to discover what it feels like to love someone who's being controlled by policies you didn't create and can't change. You get to experience the frustration of wanting to spend time with someone whose schedule and activities are managed by other people's ideas about what's safe and appropriate. The silence that followed was profound, and I could hear both of my children breathing as they processed the reversal of power that had just occurred. "How long?" Marcus asked finally. "How long do we have to deal with these restrictions?" "That depends entirely on how quickly you learn the lessons I've been trying to teach you for the past 6 weeks. When you understand the difference between caring for someone and controlling them, when you can distinguish between genuine safety concerns and administrative convenience, when you recognize that respect and protection can coexist, then we can discuss more flexible arrangements." I paused, letting them absorb this information. In the meantime, I'll be revolutionizing the healthcare industry and proving that elderly people don't lose their right to dignity and autonomy simply because they need assistance with certain tasks. I'll be demonstrating that age is not a disqualifying characteristic for intelligence, competence, or the right to make decisions about your own life. "Mom," Samantha said, her voice shaking, "we never meant to hurt you. We really thought we were doing the right thing." For the first time since this conversation began, I felt a softening in my chest. These were still my children, despite their fundamental misunderstanding of what love looked like when it was expressed through control rather than respect. "Samantha, I know you thought you were doing the right thing, but good intentions don't excuse the impact of your actions. You took away my autonomy, my independence, and my right to make decisions about my own life. You did it without consulting me, without considering my perspective, and without testing your assumptions about my capabilities." I stood up again, this time walking to the small kitchenette that tomorrow would be fully equipped for actual cooking rather than limited to institutional meal supplementation. "The fact that you thought you were helping me doesn't change the fact that you were controlling me. The fact that you were worried about my safety doesn't justify taking away my freedom to assess and manage my own risks. The fact that you love me doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without my input." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus and Samantha gradually beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened and the lessons they were being taught. By the time we hung up, they had agreed to experience the restricted visiting policies for at least 2 weeks, while they considered what they had learned about the difference between love and control. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine that Jennifer had personally selected from the new wine program we would be implementing for residents who enjoyed alcohol in moderation. I reviewed the day's accomplishments and planned tomorrow's activities, which would include a meeting with architects about redesigning common areas to be more home-like and less institutional. But mostly I thought about the expressions on the faces of residents and staff members when they realized that their world was about to change in ways that prioritized their dignity and autonomy, rather than administrative convenience and liability management. I thought about Dorothy, who was probably packing for her grandson's wedding and crying tears of joy instead of grief. I thought about Frank, who was finally going to have an investment club that actually invested in something. I thought about Dr. Morrison, who would be able to practice medicine based on individual patient needs rather than blanket institutional policies. And I thought about my children, who were about to learn what it felt like to navigate restrictions on their freedom that served no purpose other than demonstrating the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that dignity and safety were not mutually exclusive, that respect and protection could coexist, and that elderly people deserve to be treated as the intelligent, experienced adults they were, rather than as problems to be managed. But tonight, I was content to sit in my soon-to-be renovated apartment, sipping wine and savoring the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly and a lesson delivered with precision. My children had thought they could put me somewhere safe and manageable. Instead, they had provided me with the perfect platform to demonstrate exactly what real safety and genuine care looked like when they were based on respect rather than control. The revolution was just beginning. 3 months after my acquisition of Golden Years Healthcare, I stood in the main lobby of Willowbrook Manor, watching Dorothy return from her grandson's wedding in California, her face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from being included in the most important moments of family life. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers from the reception and wearing a dress that she'd chosen herself, purchased during a shopping trip with her daughter that would have been impossible under the old policies. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, rushing to embrace me with an enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable when she was grieving her lost opportunities just a few months ago. "I can't thank you enough. Not just for the wedding, but for everything. For the first time since I moved here, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing." Dorothy's transformation was just one of dozens of success stories that had emerged from our comprehensive policy overhaul. Frank had not only revitalized the investment club, but had also convinced the facility to let him teach a weekly seminar on financial planning for residents who wanted to maintain active involvement in managing their assets. 3 residents had moved back to independent living arrangements after working with our new transition support team, and 5 more were planning similar moves once they felt confident about managing their daily needs without institutional support. The changes had extended far beyond individual resident experiences. Our staff turnover rate had dropped by 60% as nurses and support personnel discovered the satisfaction of working in an environment that prioritized genuine care over defensive documentation. Dr. Morrison had implemented individualized care plans that treated each resident as a unique person rather than a collection of potential liability issues, and his patient satisfaction scores were the highest in our corporate network. Most importantly, word of our revolutionary approach had spread throughout the healthcare industry. I'd received inquiries from families across the country who wanted to move their loved ones to facilities that operated under our Dignity First protocols, and 3 major healthcare corporations had approached me about licensing our policy frameworks for their own networks. But the most significant transformation was still unfolding in my relationship with Marcus and Samantha, who had spent the past 3 months learning firsthand what it felt like to navigate the restrictive visiting policies they had once endorsed as necessary for my safety. The first week had been the most challenging for them, as they discovered that spontaneous visits weren't possible under the old system we'd temporarily maintained for their education. Marcus had driven over on a Tuesday evening, expecting to take me to dinner at our old favorite restaurant, only to be told that off-hours visits required 48-hour advance notice, and that taking residents off-premises needed medical approval that could take up to a week to process. Samantha had experienced her own lesson when she'd wanted to invite me to spend the weekend at her house for her daughter's birthday party. The request had been denied because overnight stays for social purposes weren't covered under the medical necessity requirements, and weekend staffing limitations made it impossible to provide the supervision that the old policies deemed essential for liability protection. I'd watched their frustration build through a series of increasingly desperate phone calls as they encountered every bureaucratic obstacle that other families had been dealing with for years. They'd argued with administrators about the logic of policies that separated families for no genuine safety reason. They'd pleaded with medical staff for exceptions to rules that seemed designed more for institutional convenience than resident protection. They'd experienced the dehumanizing process of having to justify their desire to spend time with someone they loved. By the end of the first month, both Marcus and Samantha had called me separately to express their understanding of what I'd been trying to teach them about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. They'd begun to recognize that policies designed to protect the facility weren't necessarily policies that protected the people living in it. "Mom," Marcus had said during one particularly emotional conversation, "I never realized how insulting these restrictions are. It's like the system assumes that elderly people lose their judgment along with their physical independence, and that families can't be trusted to make reasonable decisions about their own relatives." Samantha's awakening had been even more profound, perhaps because she'd been the most vocal advocate for putting me in institutional care in the first place. "I keep thinking about how we justified all of this by saying it was for your safety," she'd told me. "But none of these policies are really about safety. They're about making it easier for the facility to manage people by limiting their options and controlling their environment. The real breakthrough had come when I'd invited both of them to observe our new policy implementation in action, showing them how genuine safety measures could coexist with respect for individual autonomy and family relationships. They'd watched Dorothy prepare for her California trip, working with our travel support team to ensure she had necessary medications and emergency contacts, while maintaining complete freedom to make her own decisions about the risks and benefits of traveling. They'd seen Frank lead his investment seminar, demonstrating expertise and judgment that the old system had systematically ignored and undervalued. They'd observed Dr. Morrison conducting individualized medical consultations that treated residents as partners in their own healthcare rather than passive recipients of standardized protocols. Most importantly, they'd witnessed the transformation in resident morale and engagement that occurred when people were treated as competent adults capable of making informed decisions about their own lives, even when those lives included physical limitations that required institutional support. "This isn't the same place we brought you to," Samantha had observed during one of these visits. "The building is the same, but everything else is completely different." "The building is actually quite different too," I'd replied, gesturing to the renovated common areas that now featured comfortable seating arrangements conducive to real conversation, fully equipped kitchens where residents could prepare their own meals if they chose, and private spaces where families could spend time together without institutional oversight. But the most significant change was harder to quantify and impossible to measure through policy documents or facility improvements. It was the change in how residents saw themselves, and how staff members approached their work, and how families interacted with the people they loved, who happened to need assistance with certain aspects of daily living. The old system had been built on the assumption that needing help with some things meant needing supervision with everything, that physical limitations automatically implied cognitive diminishment, and that safety required the systematic elimination of choice and risk from every aspect of institutional life. Our new approach recognized that competent adults don't lose their right to make informed decisions simply because they need assistance with mobility, medication management, or other specific tasks. It acknowledged that genuine safety measures could be implemented without eliminating autonomy, and that respect for individual dignity actually enhanced rather than compromised the quality of care we provided. The success of our transformation had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A documentary film crew had approached me about creating a feature-length film about our policy revolution and its impact on both residents and families. 2 major universities had requested permission to study our operational model as part of research programs on aging and institutional care. The state health department had asked me to serve on a committee reviewing regulations for assisted living facilities across the entire state, but the validation that meant the most to me came from the residents themselves. People who had rediscovered agency and purpose and joy in their daily lives after months or years of institutional diminishment. Margaret Henley, an 80-year-old former mathematics professor, had started tutoring high school students in advanced calculus, traveling to the local school 3 days a week to work with students who needed additional support. Under the old policies, off-site activities that weren't directly related to medical care had been essentially impossible to arrange, and Margaret's expertise had been relegated to participating in elementary craft projects designed for people with cognitive impairments. Robert Chen, a retired chef who'd been forced to accept bland institutional meals under the previous system, had convinced our kitchen staff to let him teach cooking classes for residents who wanted to prepare their own food. His small batch meals had become so popular that families were requesting recipes and techniques they could use when cooking for their own elderly relatives. Even residents who chose to maintain the more structured lifestyle that institutional settings provided were benefiting from knowing that their compliance was voluntary, rather than mandatory. They participated in scheduled activities because they enjoyed them, not because alternatives weren't available. They followed facility routines because those routines met their needs, not because they had no choice in the matter. The financial impact of our changes had been surprisingly positive, despite Marcus's initial predictions that my emotional decision-making would lead to operational disasters. Resident satisfaction scores had increased dramatically, leading to higher occupancy rates and reduced marketing costs. Staff retention had improved significantly, eliminating the constant expenses associated with recruitment and training new employees. Family complaints had virtually disappeared, reducing administrative overhead and legal liability concerns. Most importantly, our reputation for innovative, respectful care had positioned Golden Years Healthcare as a premium provider in a market where families were increasingly demanding alternatives to traditional institutional models. We were charging higher rates than our competitors, while delivering services that families actually wanted, rather than services they felt forced to accept due to lack of options. The transformation had also created opportunities for residents to contribute financially to their own care in ways that enhanced their sense of agency and purpose. Margaret's tutoring had evolved into a formal academic support service that generated revenue for the facility while providing her with income and professional satisfaction. Robert's cooking classes had become popular enough to warrant expansion into a catering service for local events, creating employment opportunities for residents who wanted to remain professionally active. Frank's Investment Club had grown into a managed fund that not only provided education and engagement for participating residents, but also generated returns that helped offset the costs of enhanced programming and services. The psychological impact of contributing to their own support, rather than simply consuming institutional resources, had been profound for residents who'd spent their entire adult lives as productive, self-sufficient individuals. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been watching Marcus and Samantha discover that their mother's acquisition of a healthcare network hadn't been an emotional reaction to institutional restriction, but rather a strategic business decision that was generating both financial returns and social impact that exceeded their most optimistic projections. "Mom," Marcus had said during our most recent family dinner, which now took place in my fully equipped apartment kitchen rather than in the institutional dining room, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond just the nursing home situation. I think I've been underestimating your business judgment for longer than I want to admit." The dinner itself had been a revelation for both of my children. Instead of the bland, over-seasoned institutional food they'd expected, they'd enjoyed a meal that I'd prepared myself, using ingredients from our on-site garden and techniques I'd learned in Robert's cooking classes. The wine had come from our new beverage program that treated residents as adults capable of making informed decisions about alcohol consumption. The conversation had flowed naturally because we were in a space that felt like a home rather than an institution. "I keep thinking about all the assumptions we made," Samantha had added, helping me clear the dishes with the kind of natural family interaction that the old system had made nearly impossible. "We assumed that falling once meant you couldn't live safely alone. We assumed that asking questions about our financial inquiries meant you were becoming confused and suspicious. We assumed that choosing to live independently meant you were isolated and at risk. But mostly," she'd continued, "we assumed that loving you meant making decisions for you, rather than supporting you in making your own decisions. And I think that assumption is probably the most damaging one of all." The conversation that had followed was the most honest and productive discussion we'd had in years, touching on issues that went far beyond healthcare policies and facility management. We talked about the ways that ageism had influenced their perception of my capabilities, about the difference between reasonable concern and infantilizing control, and about how their own fears about aging and mortality had shaped their approach to managing my independence. "I think part of the problem," Marcus had admitted, "was that we were trying to prevent you from experiencing any risks or difficulties, because watching you struggle with challenges made us confront the fact that we're all aging and that none of us have complete control over what happens to us as we get older." It was an insight that explained much about their behavior and gave me hope that the lessons they were learning would extend beyond their relationship with me to their approaches to aging and autonomy in their own lives. The success of our policy revolution had also created opportunities for me to address systemic issues in healthcare that went beyond individual facility management. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about the economic benefits of dignity-based care, to consult with other healthcare companies about implementing similar reforms, and to work with advocacy organizations on legislation that would protect the rights of elderly people in institutional settings. The documentary film crew had spent 3 weeks at Willowbrook Manor, documenting not just the policy changes we'd implemented, but also the personal stories of residents whose lives had been transformed by being treated as competent adults rather than problems to be managed. The film, tentatively titled Dignity Uprising, was scheduled for release the following year, and had already generated interest from distributors who recognized the commercial potential of stories about successful aging and respectful care. But beyond the external validation and business success, the most meaningful outcome of this entire experience had been the restoration of my relationship with Marcus and Samantha, based on mutual respect rather than filial obligation mixed with condescending concern. They no longer called to check on me with the kind of worried surveillance that had characterized our interactions before my acquisition of Golden Years Healthcare. Instead, they called to share news, ask for advice, and invite me to participate in family activities as an equal, rather than as someone who needed to be managed and protected. Samantha had recently asked for my input on a major career decision, acknowledging that my decades of business experience might provide valuable perspective on her professional challenges. Marcus had invited me to review his company's expansion plans, recognizing that my analytical skills and strategic thinking remained as sharp as they'd ever been. Most importantly, they'd both begun to understand that my decision to acquire a healthcare network hadn't been an impulsive reaction to institutional frustration, but rather a carefully planned demonstration of capabilities that they'd systematically underestimated. I keep thinking about that meeting where we basically ambushed you with Dr. Peterson and all those pamphlets, Samantha had said during one recent conversation. We were so sure we knew what was best for you, and we were so confident that you couldn't possibly understand the complexity of your own situation. We treated you like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted, Marcus had added. And then we were shocked when you solved problems we didn't even know existed. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that their attempt to limit my access to my resources and independence had actually provided me with the perfect opportunity to deploy those resources in service of a cause that had generated both personal satisfaction and professional success beyond anything I'd accomplished in my previous career. 6 months after my acquisition, Golden Years Healthcare had become a case study in business schools about the commercial viability of values-based management in healthcare settings. Our resident retention rates were the highest in the industry. Our staff satisfaction scores had become benchmarks for other facilities. And our revenue growth had attracted acquisition offers from larger healthcare corporations that wanted to license our operational model. I'd turned down all of those offers, not because they weren't financially attractive, but because I understood that what we'd created couldn't be replicated simply by copying policies and procedures. It required a fundamental shift in how elderly people were perceived and treated, a recognition that age didn't automatically equal incompetence, and a commitment to distinguishing between genuine care and institutional control. The success had also created opportunities for residents to become advocates for systemic change in how society approached aging and institutional care. Dorothy had become a spokesperson for travel programs that recognized elderly people's continued desire and ability to participate in family events and explore new places. Frank had been invited to speak at financial planning seminars about the importance of maintaining active involvement in investment decisions, regardless of living situation. Margaret's tutoring program had expanded into a formal partnership between our facility and the local school district, creating opportunities for other residents to share their expertise while generating income and maintaining professional identity. The success of these programs had attracted attention from universities interested in studying the cognitive and psychological benefits of continued productive engagement for elderly people in institutional settings. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the way our success had influenced other families facing decisions about elderly care for their own relatives. We'd received hundreds of inquiries from adult children who wanted to find alternatives to traditional nursing home placement, and several had used our policy frameworks to negotiate improved conditions at other facilities. The documentary film crew had interviewed dozens of families whose approach to elderly care had been influenced by learning about our emphasis on dignity and autonomy rather than safety and control. Many had realized that their own assumptions about aging and institutional care had been shaped more by societal stereotypes than by realistic assessments of their relatives' actual capabilities and needs. What you've created here, the film's director had told me during one of our final interviews, isn't just a better nursing home. It's a demonstration that society's assumptions about aging and autonomy are both wrong and harmful, and that alternatives are not only possible but actually more successful than traditional approaches. The recognition that our work had implications beyond healthcare policy had led to invitations to speak at conferences on aging, autonomy, and social policy. I'd been asked to serve on advisory boards for organizations working to combat ageism in employment, housing, and healthcare. Universities had requested my participation in research studies on successful aging and the relationship between autonomy and quality of life in elderly populations. But the validation that meant the most to me continued to come from residents whose lives had been transformed by being treated with the respect and dignity that should be every person's right regardless of age or physical limitations. Eleanor Martinez, a 90-year-old former attorney, had resumed practicing law on a part-time basis, providing legal assistance to other residents and their families from an office we'd created within the facility. Her work had prevented several families from being exploited by unscrupulous elder care services and had helped numerous residents navigate complex insurance and healthcare bureaucracies. William Thompson, a retired engineer, had designed and supervised the installation of accessibility modifications throughout our facility that were both more effective and more aesthetically pleasing than standard institutional solutions. His innovations had been so successful that other facilities were requesting consultations on implementing similar improvements. These weren't just feel-good stories about elderly people staying active. They were demonstrations that competence, expertise, and judgment don't automatically deteriorate with age, and that institutional policies that assume otherwise are both wasteful and harmful. The financial implications of recognizing and utilizing residents' continued capabilities had been substantial. Instead of paying outside consultants for services that residents could provide, we were creating income opportunities for people who wanted to remain professionally engaged. Instead of hiring additional staff for tasks that residents could perform independently, we were investing in accessibility modifications that enhanced autonomy while reducing labor costs. Most importantly, we'd created a model that demonstrated the economic viability of treating elderly people as assets rather than liabilities, as sources of expertise and experience rather than simply consumers of expensive care services. The success had also attracted attention from technology companies interested in developing products and services that enhanced rather than replaced human autonomy in elderly care settings. We'd partnered with several innovative firms to test assistive technologies that helped residents maintain independence rather than substituting institutional supervision for personal agency. Smart home systems that provided safety monitoring without restricting freedom of movement had proven particularly successful, allowing residents to live in their own apartments with minimal supervision while ensuring that help was available if needed. Communication technologies that connected residents with family members, healthcare providers, and community resources had enhanced social engagement without requiring institutional mediation of all external relationships. But we'd been careful to ensure that technological solutions supported, rather than replaced, human connection and personal choice. The goal wasn't to create more efficient ways to manage elderly people, but rather to develop tools that enhanced their ability to manage their own lives according to their own preferences and priorities. The approach had influenced not just how we operated our own facilities, but how families throughout our region thought about elderly care options. We'd become a destination for people who wanted alternatives to traditional institutional placement, and our success had encouraged other healthcare providers to reconsider their own policies and procedures. More importantly, we demonstrated that the choice between safety and autonomy was a false dilemma, that genuine care could coexist with respect for individual dignity, and that treating elderly people as competent adults was both morally right and economically viable. As I sat in my apartment 9 months after acquiring Golden Years Healthcare, reviewing reports on our continued success and planning expansion into additional markets, I reflected on the lessons that Marcus and Samantha had learned about the difference between love and control, between protection and respect, between care and management. Their transformation had been as significant as any of the changes we'd implemented in our facilities. They'd learned to see me not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be respected, not as a liability to be managed, but as a resource to be valued, not as a burden to be contained, but as a family member to be included. The visiting restrictions I'd imposed on them had lasted only 6 weeks, but the education they'd received about the impact of institutional policies on family relationships had been permanent. They now understood viscerally what it felt like to have bureaucratic procedures interfere with their desire to spend time with someone they loved, and they'd become advocates for policies that prioritized family connection over administrative convenience. "Mom," Marcus had said during our most recent conversation, "I think the most important thing we learned isn't just about nursing home policies. It's about not making assumptions about what people are capable of, based on stereotypes or fears or our own need to feel like we're protecting them." Samantha had expressed similar insights about the broader implications of what they'd experienced. I find myself questioning assumptions about age and competence in other areas of my life now. When I hear people talking about elderly family members like they're children who need to be managed, I remember what it felt like to be treated that way ourselves. The lessons had extended to their own planning for aging and their approach to elderly relatives on both sides of the family. They'd become vocal advocates for policies and practices that preserve dignity and autonomy while providing necessary support, and they'd used their experience with our facility transformation to help other families navigate eldercare decisions. Most importantly, they'd learned that underestimating someone based on age or any other characteristic was not just morally wrong but practically foolish, and that respecting people's autonomy and judgment was not just ethically correct, but often led to better outcomes than controlling and managing them. The success of Golden Years Healthcare had proven that businesses built on respect for human dignity weren't just feel-good enterprises. They were more profitable, more sustainable, and more successful than traditional models that treated people as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be served. Our approach had influenced policy discussions at state and federal levels, contributed to research on successful aging and institutional care, and provided a model that other healthcare companies were attempting to replicate in their own operations. But the most satisfying outcome remained the daily evidence that elderly people who were treated with respect and dignity thrived in ways that traditional institutional care had never allowed, and that families who were supported rather than controlled maintained stronger, healthier relationships with their elderly relatives. As I prepared for sleep in my comfortable apartment, surrounded by my own furniture and possessions, able to choose my own schedule and activities, connected to my family through relationships based on mutual respect rather than filial obligation, I reflected on the journey that had begun with my children's well-intentioned but misguided attempt to manage my independence. They'd thought they were protecting me from the risks and challenges of aging alone. Instead, they'd provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that age was not a barrier to innovation, achievement, and success, and that being elderly didn't mean being diminished. The acquisition of Golden Years Healthcare hadn't just been a business decision or a personal statement. It had been a demonstration that competence, wisdom, and capability don't disappear at age 70, that elderly people deserve to be treated as the intelligent, experienced adults they are, and that genuine care enhances rather than eliminates individual autonomy. My children had learned that love expressed through control wasn't really love at all, and that protection, that eliminated choice, wasn't really protection, but rather a form of imprisonment disguised as care. The revolution we'd started at Willowbrook Manor had spread throughout our network, influenced policy discussions across the industry, and provided hope for thousands of families seeking alternatives to traditional institutional elder care. But most importantly, it had proven that the choice between safety and dignity was a false one, that respect and protection could coexist, and that treating people as capable adults regardless of their age or physical limitations wasn't just morally right, but practically beneficial for everyone involved. The lesson had been delivered with precision, the point had been made indelibly, and the impact would continue long after the specific details of policy changes and business acquisitions had been forgotten. My children had wanted to put me somewhere safe and manageable. Instead, they'd provided me with the platform to revolutionize an entire industry while teaching them the most important lesson about love, respect, and the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.